Welcome everyone! Today, we will be reviewing the chapters where Edward Wu, the King of Hades, faces off against Raian, Irio, Xingwu, Hollis, and Ryaki. Without wasting any time, let's jump right in. On the first page, we can see Edward Wu smoking a cigar, ranting about the lunch he had earlier on how good it was. He then turns his attention to someone, asking them if they wanted to take him head-on. This person turns out to be Kure Raian, whom Edward had probably knocked out, calling him a poor excuse of an assassin. Edward, joined by his two subordinates, tells Raian to stay asleep, and states that by the time he wakes up, the world would be a much different place. The two men accompanying Edward are revealed to be the fist-breaking king, Solomon Wu, and the king of brutality, Fabio Wu. Solomon says to Fabio that he is in disbelief that Alan had trouble dealing with Raian. Fabio replies, saying that they expected too much from him, and he tries to recall what people in manga would say in a moment like this. Solomon elaborates on Alan, saying that he was the weakest amongst them, and was a disgrace to the Wu clan. Edward calls him out, saying that he always says stuff like that when a relative dies. Fabio chimes in, saying there's nothing wrong with catchphrases, and encourages Edward to adopt one. Edward jokingly asks Solomon if he could have at least been a bit more positive with his catchphrase. Suddenly, Fabio quickly turns around and throws a kick at an awakened Raian, who manages to block it. Solomon takes this opportunity to charge at Raian, and knocks him back. However, Raian tries to sneak in an eye poke, but he gets stopped by Fabio, who captures both of his arms, holding him in place. Solomon begins to punch away at a defenseless Raian, as Edward states that these two men are his spares. Edward claims that he processes the ego of Wu Hei, thanks to Huisheng. He elaborates on Huisheng, stating that he's a tricky person, and explains that one could use Huisheng on the entire clan to mass-produce heirs, but that would lead to anarchy, due to Wu's personality not wanting to serve anyone else. However, if the successor dies, then Huisheng stops there, which is why Edward needs spares like them. He then speaks about the two Alan clones that Raian had killed, revealing that there are 5 clones of Edward's in the Westward faction, though they call each other names out of convenience, as he realizes that they are now down to 4. Suddenly, Raian frees himself from Fabio and Solomon's tag team by unleashing his removal transformation, and begins fighting them both simultaneously until Edward steps in and kicks Raian away. He states that they share perfect sync, since they're all basically alternate versions of him. He then starts laughing at Raian, due to the angered expression on his face, and asks him if he thinks this fight is unfair. Edward answers his own question, saying that this is indeed unfair, and tells Raian that they're going to be fighting him unfairly. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, the mighty demon Kure Irio stabs Fabio in the back with a katana, stating that it's now a 2-on-2. Moving on to chapter 140, Edward says to Irio that he thought he had retired. Suddenly, Fabio jolts up with anger, which surprises Irio. Fabio angrily shouts at him, saying that he killed his brother, and tells Irio that it's time to die. Irio jokingly replies, asking him who he is referring to. Analyzing his attack, Irio noticed that he had missed Fabio's heart, realizing he's not as sharp as he once was. However, he knows that a blow like that should be fatal, which means that the Westward clan must be a different breed from the Kure clan, given their increased durability. Fabio tells Irio that he has been waiting for a long time to face him, as he starts sprinting towards Irio. Prepared for Fabio's arrival, Irio flicks something sharp between his fingers, causing the object to pierce Solomon's neck. Irio then quickly moves behind him and grabs hold of the katana. He then twists the weapon in Fabio's chest, and moves the blade upward, slicing Fabio's upper body in half. He then tells Edward that he is next, so Edward attempts to stop Irio by flicking an object in between his fingers, but Irio dodges, and advances towards him to cut him in half. However, Edward effortlessly dodges the 2 incoming blades. Edward had almost forgotten that sneak attacks were Wu Xing's specialty. Wu Xing, the head of the Wu clan, joins the battle against Edward Wu, announcing that he has avenged his uncle with Fabio's death. And now he plans to avenge his beloved. Edward tells him to calm down, and tells them both that it is not often that the head of their clans meet together in one room, and calmly asks them to chat. He then says to both men that he understands that they are upset about losing relatives, but they have killed some of his own people too, so none of them have the high ground, basically an eye for an eye. He offers both men a deal, telling them to leave it all in the past, and come join his clan instead. Ignoring Edward, both warriors dash towards him to strike him down, but Edward easily blocks their attacks. They try to attack him again, but Edward kicks Xing away and stomps on Irio's katana, breaking a part of the blade. Irio backs away, while Xing Wu attempts to get back on his feet. Edward charges at him to deliver a punch, but he fakes it and kicks him instead, knocking Xing back. Irio tries his luck and sneak attacks Edward from behind, but Edward casually elbows him in the stomach, sending him flying. Edward then calls them an old-fashioned bunch, disappointed at the fact they haven't passed that level yet. He then tells them that he has no time for antiques, and says that they have evolved the wrong way. Continuing his speech, he states that there has been no contest since the clan first split, but he now claims that his clan are the evolved Wu, and that they're both pebbles in their way. Xing Wu calls Edward's arrogance palpable, and promises to show him the power of the original Wu with his death. Edward scoffs at the title of the original Wu, and tells Xing that his old-fashioned techniques are outdated, as he walks towards him. Xing immediately uses the rope attached to the weapon, and swings it at Edward, who effortlessly blocks it. However, that attack was a trick, as Xing pulls back the blade with lightning speed, making a thop sound, which confuses Edward for a moment, making him turn his attention to Irio. Seizing this opportunity, Xing rushes to slash Edward, but he shatters the top of the blade into pieces. Edward was disappointed in himself that he fell for the oldest trick in the book, which angers him. He retaliates and punches at Xing, but he blocks the punch and ties Edward's wrists with the rope on his sword and shoots a sharp object out of his mouth, which Edward sees coming and dodges it. Xing tries to stop Edward again, but he gets his arm caught, as Edward tells him that his efforts weren't good enough. A thud can be heard as Edward punches Xing so hard that he's sent flying, but luckily Irio catches him. Edward repeats his earlier statement, saying that they're now in the 21st century, questioning why would someone swing a blade when they can kill a man with one finger. Xing thanks Irio for the save, but Irio warns him that he needs to stay on his feet, as they know that Edward is stronger than both of them combined. Edward then tells Irio that he is getting old, and if he was in his prime, he might have been able to kill him. Insulted by his statement, Irio tells Edward that he should know his place, and clarifies that when they first met, he was past his prime. If he was still in his prime, Edward would have been child's play to him. Suddenly, Raian screams at Irio and Xing to move out the way, as Solomon comes flying at them from behind, which they manage to dodge him. Solomon asks Edward about Fabio's whereabouts, and Edward tells him that he is dead. Xing then tells Irio that it's time, which he agrees, while Raian screams at them to leave. In an instant, both Irio and Xing transform into their removal forms, utilizing 100%. Believing that he can take on both Edward and Solomon on his own, Raian screams at his grandfather to get out of his way, but Irio tells him to shut up. Realizing they're outnumbered, Solomon asks Edward on what they should do now, and Edward simply tells him their task is simple, as they just need to eliminate them all. The scene then cuts to Seiji, getting his ass beat by Narashima Joji, who tells him that there is a reason they call him the venomous spider, as he is known for striking his opponent's vital points, which immobilizes them like poison. However, he states that it is quite hard to hit an opponent's vital point when they're moving, and embarrassingly admits that he missed a few times, but he doesn't mind, because his strikes hurt no matter where they land. Seiji, in panic and desperation, starts begging for his life, telling them that he's not the guy they want. But Narashima doesn't believe his lies, and pokes him in the throat, causing him great pain. Narashima then asks Seiji if he's calling Kureishi a liar, since he'd always trust Kureishi because he would never wrong him. Kureishi adds that Xia seems to be crumbling under the pressure, and is clearly trying to pass the buck off. Xia starts pleading for the men to wait and to stop hurting him, as he admits to being the one they're looking for, while raising his hand. However, Kureishi breaks his arm knowing that he would try something fishy. Kureishi then searches Xia's sleeve, and finds the hidden weapon he was hiding, all while Xia is in pure agony. He then tells Narashima that he has seized the goods, to which Narashima praises him for his efforts. Kureishi noticed that the knife wasn't there when he dislocated his wrist, deducing that Xia must be some sort of magician. Suddenly, Xia grows an extra pair of balls, and starts threatening the men, saying that they won't be gloating for long. He warns them that his men will be here any minute now, and that they are more formidable than his foot soldiers, and confidently states that when these men arrive, both Kureishi and Narashima will be done for. Xia had originally sent his men after Oma Takeda, but since he's been backed into a corner, getting rid of these guys is now top priority. Unfortunately for Xia, Kure tells him that his men aren't coming to his aid, which fills him with dread. The scene then shifts to Mikazuchi Rei, taking out Xia's men with little effort, while Hatsumi-san is also battling Xia's soldiers with relative ease, while glazing himself. Despair falls upon Xia, as Narushima starts talking about Hatsumi's grandfather, who is the founder of the Aikido style, and is an old friend of the patriarch of the Kure clan, of which he's also good friends with himself. He deduces that Hatsumi must have used his connection to get in touch with them, and for whatever reason, Mikazuchi Rei was already training with the clan, which seems as if Shing is pulling strings behind the scenes. Looking at the defeated Xia, Kureishi enlightens him on how they knew all of this info. It was actually Shing that asked them to deal with him. At first they didn't want to get involved in the whole killing business, but the worm's actions pissed them off, so they offered to help as much as they could. After that explanation, Kureishi and Narushima decided to continue Xia's judgment. Xia, realizing that he's completely and utterly screwed, goes into full panic mode. Returning back to the fight, Kure Raian advances towards Solomon, but he decides to skip past him and go straight for Edward, leaving Shing to fend off Solomon. Having just lit a new cigar, Edward is annoyed that Raian decided to fight him first. Raian throws a right hook, but Edward ducks it and uppercuts Raian. Then suddenly, Irio sneaks behind Edward for a sneak attack, but Edward already sees him coming and knocks him away. He then grabs Raian's face and slams him to the ground. Both Raian and Irio tries to attack Edward, but he hits them both with one punch. Edward tells them that they're just embarrassing themselves with this performance. However, Raian and Irio will not back down, as they use their Kure clan tradition technique, Jonkue Lion Bite. But Edward shuts down their combined effort and blows them away with his overwhelming strength, while in the background Shing defeats Solomon. Edward then tells them to watch closely, as he demonstrates why he's the number one Wu Hei, and uses his removal at 100%. With just a flick, Edward punches Irio, moving at an incredible speed. Raian is next, as Edward swiftly punches him, as well as doing the same to Shing, knocking all three combatants away with just 3 swift blows. With that performance, Edward lets them all know that they're all nothing to him, after showing them the power of the Westward Wu, a power of conquerors who've all spread across the world, and now it's time for them to accept their death. Edward then turns to Solomon, calling his performance an embarrassment, reminding him that he is a Wu, and that he should act like it, to which Solomon apologizes. He depowers from his removal while handing Solomon a knife, telling him to finish the job. He decides to leave to get some legs, telling Solomon to meet him outside when he's finished. Just as he begins walking away, Solomon's head comes flying behind him, causing him to sigh in annoyance. It is then revealed that it was Irio who decapitated Solomon while sporting his removal at 100%. He states that you were too strong, that's why you lost, while Edward looks like he just wants this fight to end. Irio then tosses the knife at Edward, but he dodges it. However, the knife gets caught by someone who has snuck up behind him. Noticing this, Edward stops the knife just in time, revealing that both Kure Ryuki and Kure Hollis have come to the aid of Irio. Seeing Hollis, Edward recognizes him, noting that he must be his father's son. Edward replies to Hollis' comment about ending him, saying there's no chance that will happen. The scene then shifts to Oma and his friends in the hallway of the arena. While walking towards the exit, Oma notices something and stops to investigate. Seeing his friend being left behind, Yamashita asks him if there's something wrong, but Oma tells him it's nothing, and says to him that he should go on ahead. Even though he's confused as to why Oma would tell him this, he decides to go on without him. Oma then calls out to the person who has been secretly watching him. Having been found, Mutiba comes out of hiding, impressed that Oma managed to sense him, prompting him to ask if the Kure clan had taught him that. Oma recognizes Mutiba, since he was also a participant in the Kengan Annihilation Tournament. Mutiba then greets Oma, noting that they have never spoken to each other before. He then fills him in on what's been going on between the Kure clan and Edward Wu, and says that the Kure clan are having trouble fighting him, and states that Edward's strength is on par with the intruder, if not more powerful than him. He then asks Oma on what his decision will be, and offers his services if he needs it. However, Oma requests for him to show him the way, which Mutiba would gladly do so, but informs Oma that he charges extra for doing odd jobs, to which he accepts his deal. Going back to the fight, the struggle continues as Hollis blocks the barrage of attacks from Edward, while utilizing 50% of removal, which Edward notices and calls out. Kure sneaks up on Edward again and tries to hold him in place so he can sacrifice himself, but Edward throws him off, sending him flying towards the wall. Now both Hollis and Irio pulls out their weapons and lunges forward at Edward. Edward first stops Hollis by punching him, and quickly spins around and hits Irio with a devastating punch, which stuns the old man's heart, causing him to drop his blade. Edward then finishes off Irio with a bear hug, cracking Irio's spine instantly. Dropping him to the floor, Edward says that it's a shame that not even the mighty demon Irio can overcome age. He then calls him pathetic for using his relatives as sacrificial pawns, and tells him to just die in order to not tarnish his legacy any more than he had already done. Suddenly, Xing comes up behind Edward and stabs him in the neck, taking him by surprise. Irio begins laughing maniacally at Edward, calling him a fool, revealing that he was the sacrificial pawn all along, and now he is finished. Thinking that it's finally over, Xing praises Irio for his sacrifice. We then enter a flashback between the relatives, with Irio stating that if the Wu and their various branches were to be classified as assassins and combatants, Edward would be the archetype of a combatant. He also mentions that he was once a combatant, but now he's grown too old. Knowing how strong Edward is, Irio realizes that the combined strength of the four of them cannot hope to face Edward head-on, so they'll have to face him as assassins, knowing that sacrifices will be inevitable. Both Hollis and Raian had offered to sacrifice themselves in an effort to defeat Edward, but Irio calls them fools for throwing their lives away at such a young age, as he knows that it should be their elders who should die instead of them. He lastly requests Xing to handle the rest. Thankful for his comrade's sacrifice, Xing promises to Irio that it will not be in vain, but unfortunately for the group, their efforts were futile, as Edward begins pulling out the blade from his neck. Having almost died, Edward is now furious, stating that this is the last time they've pissed him off, and calls Irio a pathetic old man. The relatives watch in horror and anger, as their attack had failed, with Xing being confused on why the poison he injected isn't working on Edward. Hollis deduces that Edward must have used removal on his artery to stop the poison. While Raian is frustrated that he's unable to move, and wonders how his grandfather fought Edward head-on. Irio is left impressed that a sneak attack wasn't enough to take down Edward. Suddenly, Kure Raian gets back on his feet to run it back with Edward. Raian angrily tells his grandfather that he didn't ask for that stunt he pulled. Meanwhile, Edward is annoyed that another Kure member has risen again to challenge him. He advances towards Raian and lands a clean punch, followed by him grabbing Raian and throwing him to the ground, to set up his Wu Clan ultimate technique, Mountain Star Eightfold Demolition, and unleashes a barrage of attacks at Raian. However, he shrugs them off, and strikes Edward with a punch of his own, which Edward then returns the favor, and punches Raian, who also does the same, until both men engage in a slugfest. Seeing Raian's newfound power, both Xing and Raian are surprised that he is now suddenly stronger than he was before, but the one who was the most surprised was Edward Wu, who was confused as to why he hasn't killed this fledgling yet. Recalling his statement he made earlier to Edward, when he said you were too strong, that's why you lost, he elaborates on this, saying that his excessive strength breeds overconfidence, which is one reason for his downfall. And another thing, remember when he said that if he was in his prime, he would be child's play to him. Well, the so-called fledgling that Edward claims he should have killed already, will one day surpass Irio in his prime. After Irio finishes his speech, Kure Raian proceeds to stick his finger into Edward's open wound, and rips out his throat. Now on the floor slowly dying, Edward finally accepts his defeat, but he claims that this is all the beginning of a massive party. Unfortunately for him, he won't be around long enough to be a part of it. Having grown tired of Edward's existence, Kure Raian smashes his head into the concrete, killing Edward instantly. Hollis tells Raian to take it easy, but he tells him to bug off. Having finally avenged his master, Xing licks his picture, assuring his spirit that it can now find repose. Soon Oma, Fusue and Kure came to Irio's aid, but unfortunately they were too late. Oma looks at Irio in pure shock, while Kure sits by his side. Irio asks of the worms hiding in the arena, and Kure tells him that they've been captured, and that Uncle Horio is hunting down the remnants as they speak. Pleased to hear this, Irio knows all is well, and then tells Hollis to handle the rest. Oma, who looks visibly upset, angrily asked Fusue if she knew this was going to take place, and why she didn't stop Irio. However, Kure stops Oma, stating that Irio's decision is final. Noticing Oma's presence, Irio acknowledges him as his great-grandson-in-law, to which Oma stubbornly refuses he'll be. Irio laughs at Oma's stubborn refusal to be his son-in-law, calling him quite the jokester. But he leaves Oma with some advice, stating that he should tread carefully, cause if his hunch is correct, the foe Oma is contending with is someone far beyond him. He then calls out to Raian, already knowing that he probably wouldn't listen to him if he told him to stay out of it. He then lectures Raian once more, telling him that he couldn't defeat Edward Wu on his own, so he'll have to improve himself and surpass himself, while being of help to Oma. Raian tells his grandfather off, annoyed, that he just had to get one more lecture in. Oma starts pleading for Irio to not give up, but Irio knows that his time has come, as he dies smiling, wishing his children the best. The scene then shifts to Hatsumi, Mikazuchi Rei, and Mutiba all in the arena's hallway. Machuba jokingly says that this feels like a class reunion, which Hatsumi agrees. However, Mutiba was surprised that they both were involved, and asked them why they joined the Kure clan in exterminating the worm. Mikazuchi Rei confesses that he has an unpaid debt to the Kure and the Wu clan, but already knew that the worm would have threatened the order of the underground world if left unchecked. Hatsumi shares the same reason with Mikazuchi, and admits that he didn't take any part in the killings, and was only taking part in the clean parts of the job. Hearing this, Mutiba laughs, telling Hatsumi that he is lucky that he got to do the clean part of the job. Suddenly, someone appears in the hallway, apologizing to Mutiba. Mutiba recognizes this person, as it is revealed to be Oma, who had just left the battlefield. Mutiba asks Oma if he wouldn't be able to get his combat bonus, to which Oma says he won't. Mikazuchi calls out to Oma asking about Irio, to which Oma tells him the unfortunate news. The scene then cuts again to Mitsudo Katahara, where one of his bodyguards tells him the unfortunate news. His son, Katahara Retsudo, asks him if something is wrong, but Mitsudo tells him there's nothing wrong, and decides to take his leave after realizing Nogi had handled everything. While walking through the hallway, Katahara reminisces about the time him and Irio spent together when they were young. Caring deeply for his close friend, he painfully calls him an idiot. Kure Irio, the patriarch of the Kure clan, passes away. Returning back to the Kure clan, Hollis notes that the westward faction isn't dead yet, and that there are 5 remaining members with Hei's personality, which they've found out in their investigation. This means that there is one last Wu Hei left, and with Edward dead, the moderates of the faction will be spurred into action, which means total war with the westward faction. Shifting back to Kureishi and Narushima, Kureishi admits that they've gone a bit overboard, which Narushima also agrees. Zooming out, it would appear that Xiaji managed to escape from both Kureishi and Narushima, despite his injuries. Kureishi asks Narushima if they should go after Xiaji, but Narushima tells him not to bother, since they said they could afford to let him go, although he wasn't planning to do so. He then wonders how Xiaji managed to escape without Kureishi knowing, and what kind of trick he pulled. It also seems that Hayami caught wind of the news about Irio's death, and like the bastard he truly is, he celebrates his death and immediately regroups his guardians at once, confident that there is no one who will stand in his way now. He declares that he will have the last laugh, and that the Kengan association will be his. However, his son rains on his parade and calls him a maggot, urging them to finish their unfinished business. And that would conclude this story for now. If you enjoyed, why not drop a sub and a like on this video for future Kengan content? If there's any chapters you want to see covered on this channel, feel free to recommend them in the comments. Until then, have a nice day or night.